Okay, we are at the 5th International Conference of Violence in Schools in Mendoza, Argentina, and thank you for agreeing to this interview. Would you like to start by introducing yourself?
Thanks, Andy. My name's Philip Slee, and I'm Professor in Human Development in the School of Education at Flinders University and in Adelaide, South Australia, so a long way from home.
What's your professional background?
My background is in school teaching, and I was a primary school teacher, and then I moved from there into working with children with special needs, and then further on in looking and working with mothers and their babies. That was my PhD, and the emotional life of mothers and infants, the expressivity of their relationships. And so I moved away from teaching in that classroom sense, and but I'm currently, and have been for a number of years, involved in preparation of undergraduates service training for teachers.
Okay. And what about violence and bullying? How do you deal with that on a professional level?
So I've got a number of different research interests. So probably around about in the early 90s in Australia, a colleague and I had heard a presentation from overseas, and on the basis of that got us wondering, with both of our backgrounds in teaching, whether or not the same level of bullying was reported in Australian schools. So we decided, given our background in research methodology and questionnaire development, we developed a questionnaire, and I had colleagues out in the school, and so I approached them, and we administered some questionnaires to primary and secondary school children, and we were essentially asking them about the extent of bullying, the nature of it, a little about the impact it had. We also asked them some questions about how frequently it occurred, how safe they felt at school. So the questionnaire initially was reasonably comprehensive, and we collected data then, and we went on to collect data. So we've got a data pool of about 25,000 students now across Australia, from every state and from every jurisdiction and school sector, private, Catholic, public. And on the basis of that, our research interests in bullying kind of picked up a pace, and we went on to find that the schools in Australia in the 90s didn't have a great deal of thought about the nature of bullying and whether it occurred or not and its impact. So we began with the research as a basis to work with schools and particularly school authorities to develop policies and practice. We thought they were important, and on the basis of that our research generated around school bullying and violence. And we went on and made submissions to various government inquiries, Senate inquiries, about whether bullying existed, and we used our research to inform those inquiries, whether it was the same or different from violence. And those government inquiries then started to sensitise the local state authorities and also the national authorities to the issue of bullying. So I came to that around that background in teaching and an interest in it, and we found that there was quite a high level of bullying in Australian schools, a reasonably low level of violence, but a high level of bullying. And that set us thinking about what could be done about it, why it existed in the forms that it did, and the impact on children. So we then started to develop programs about it.
Did you find in this research any schools that were in denial that any bullying existed in their schools?
Yeah, and it was a very interesting process to go through. We found whole school state authorities were in denial about it. And our initial research, when we would go public through the media and do radio and television, we found that at the school level they were saying, well, it might happen, but it doesn't happen in our school. Or, well, there might be some, we don't know about it, and I'm sure that if it did happen, it doesn't hurt people. Or the principals, some teachers would say, well, it happened to me, and look how I turned out, I'm fine. And then we found authorities, particularly when we went public, would get quite agitated about when we reported on the frequency and commented on the impact it had on the kids in the classroom and in the school. And that denial extended on occasion to suggesting that we should not continue with that work, that so we had to deal with a lot of aggravation initially.
Wow.
They were interesting times.
Yes. So within Australia itself, you've got a broad mix of cultures?
Yes, that's a really interesting question, because at the moment, I mean, Australia is, with the indigenous people, Australia is essentially an immigrant country, and we have a wide range of people from different countries and cultures and backgrounds that have come to Australia and settled there. I think at the moment there's a very interesting political debate about multiculturalism and whether or not it's working in the way that Australia conceives of multiculturalism. So in that sense we live in quite interesting times. So there is a really interesting background to the makeup of what constitutes Australia and its culture, I think.
Do you find that within these different cultures in Australia that how bullying is perceived and how it's dealt with is different, or is it the same?
No, we've not found that there's any, with our large-scale sample, we don't find dramatic differences that exist either in the rural or the remote or the urban areas, nor did we find or do we find dramatic differences across culture in the extent and nature to which bullying occurs. What we do find is what is generally reported overseas, that males and females will report that they experience different kinds of bullying, different levels of bullying, and I think sociologically that reflects something about the groups and the way boys' groups are constructed and the way they mix, and the way girls' groups are constructed and the way they mix. But it also represents something about the developmental level of the kids, I think, from primary to secondary. So some of our research has matched up internationally, and there are very common themes that emerge, and that's always helpful to know. I think some of our cross-cultural work that we've done, particularly in the Pacific Rim, in countries like Japan, has been very illuminating. Japan had a very long history in the study of school bullying, that largely because of the cultural language barriers, the Western countries were not that aware of. It assumes and is understood to be in a different form. Ijime reflects some of those cultural differences, I think, but it also manifests itself differently, and it means that there are different ways of approaching it. And I think that's one of the implications, that looking and working with countries internationally gives you better insight into how you might go and address the issues.
If one looks around the world, there tends to be one or two anti-bullying programs that are used an awful lot in all countries. Do you find, in your experience, that anti-bullying initiatives created in one country are easily used in another country?
I think my broad answer to that is that those programs need to be adapted to the culture and the background the history of the country that you're working with. But along with that, I think that even within a country, when an anti-bullying program is delivered, that a key feature for me around those programs is the ability for those programs to adapt to the local conditions, so the local environment, and to be responsive to that. That does create some issues that sort of conflict with the science. So I think that there's a sense in which anti-bullying programs should be evidence-based. There should be some common core to them, that it should be delivered in a kind of pill and dose effect. That means that you can look at and reasonably attribute change to those programs. And of course, once you start to modify them in any environment or in any school setting or classroom setting, well, then it becomes much more difficult to attribute change to that program. So I think it's always a balance. The science is always, for me, a bit of a balance. I think an overriding consideration for us to be informed about a program is that program should have some evidence base to it. It should have some quality assurance, so that, because there's just a plethora of programs out there, as we know, and as you referred to in this question, it's really important to distinguish those which have an impact, because programs can either work for the good or not, and just because it's a program and doesn't mean that it's actually going to have a positive outcome. I think we have to be aware that a program delivered, particularly in the busy life of a school and a teacher's life, can have hopefully some positive outcomes, but there's also the risk that it can have some negative outcomes. Mm-hmm. So that's why I think we need the science there to back up what gets delivered, and teachers need to be reassured that what their time, the time of their kids, that detracts in a sense from, or cannot, I mean, it's time away from some of the core business of school, that those programs actually make a difference to children.
If you're approached by a child that you're working with, or that you have some working relationship with, and they tell you that they're getting bullied, what's your response?
Some of that would reflect, I think some of my responses to that would reflect my background in child and family therapy, because that is one part of what I do. I think that there's a common core set of understandings that has evolved out of the international research that indicates, well, these would be some things that could be done to help kids cope. And I think they often get reflected. So kids are often told, well, if you're being bullied, then you should talk to somebody or find a trusted adult or talk to your peer group. It depends a bit on the developmental level. Go and speak to a teacher, use the school's policy and procedures. But I think we're at that stage now in the science where we need to be looking carefully at nuancing that kind of advice. So just to give you an example, some research that a colleague and I conducted recently asked a range of experts. We were interested in coping strategies that kids use, and we asked a range of experts from around the world, teachers and counsellors and researchers. We presented them with about 25 or 26 coping strategies, a bit like talk to somebody or find a trusted adult, and some negative strategies like pretend it's not happening, etc., or try and avoid going to school, stay away. And we asked them to rate what were the successful and the unsuccessful strategies. The experts rated strategies that were essentially behaviourally focused as successful. So their advice that they thought was really good advice was talk to somebody, find a trusted adult, use your peer group, go look at the school's policy and procedures. But when we went to kids, because we then went to a very large sample of kids, and we gave them the same set of questions, and we asked them to rate what were the coping strategies that they would use if they were in that situation or had been in that situation. And we found that the kids who had not been bullied gave the same responses as the adults and the experts. So they would say things like, well, if I was being bullied, I would talk to an adult and I would use the school's policy or procedures, or I'd go and tell my friends. But we also asked the kids about their experiences of bullying, and we found that the ones who had actually experienced bullying gave very different responses from either the academics or the researchers or the experts and the ones that hadn't. They would use emotion-focused strategies. So they said, well, when I was bullied, what I did was I pretended it wasn't happening, for example. That was an effective strategy. Or I just ignored it. So they gave emotion-focused strategies as an approach to their coping. And what that told us about it is that we have to nuance the advice that we give. We have to be sensitive to that child's background and that child's experience around school bullying, and tailor the advice accordingly. So I don't think we can have a kind of set menu that we trot out.
So there needs to be some kind of flexibility.
And there needs to be flexibility, and there needs to be some consideration of that young person's experience and how that experience would colour their responses. But I think for us it also highlighted the fact that school bullying does have such a negative impact when it's something that occurs frequently. It impacts on the child's feelings and their emotions. It generates different feelings and emotions. We know that from the research that boys are more likely to get angry about it. Girls are more likely to get depressed. So I think there are some common things that it evokes in kids.
What would you say to somebody who said, it's all very well this anti-bullying stuff, but for somebody to go through bullying and to find then a way to deal with it, to suffer it, to deal with it, is actually going to make them a stronger person. So why not just let people deal with bullying themselves?
That's a challenging question, because I think it goes to the core of appreciating where that individual child or young person is and how that experience has had an impact on them. So my view is that yes, some children are probably more resilient than others, and they're more adaptable and more able to cope, but that by and large that assertion of power by one individual or group over another is a negative thing, and it impacts on the individual's well-being. And so that, I think that's why we as a community have a duty of care that we should be conscious of, and that I think that there are certain groups of kids, young people, who are more vulnerable. So we know from the research that we've done, for example, that students with disabilities are considerably more vulnerable. Children with Asperger's, autism spectrum disorders, there is work we've done with their finds a significantly elevated level of bullying. And so I think that as a community, as a culture, or as a community, that we have that duty of responsibility to provide the safest possible learning environment for kids, so that they get a chance to flourish and grow and develop. And that, for me, as an educator, is something that's what I would want. As a parent, that's certainly what I would want for our children, that they would grow and develop not in an environment that was negative, but one that was encouraging and positive.
Okay. So what does the word bullying actually mean to you?
Again, I think that goes to the heart of the matter for me, and it often generates an emotional response. I was fortunate to come from a family where I had a lot of support. I went to a school where I had a good peer system, But for me, it's also a social justice issue, and it's about power. And so the heart of the definition for me is the use of power in a relationship. And I think that experience is one of the things that markedly impacts on a child or a young person or anyone, even an adult who experiences it in the workplace, where it evokes lots of different feelings. And so it's something I've grappled with a lot, particularly from a family therapy point of view, around what is power, how does it get used, and how is it understood, and how is it expressed. I don't think it's a very slippery concept, and it's not one that's easily understood or appreciated, but it certainly is when you experience it. As soon as that happens, it evokes such a visceral kind of thing that you think, oh, yes, well, I don't like that. And we know that. And so for me, the heart of the issue is around that imbalance in power.
Imbalance of power.
Imbalance.
There are many ways, many strategies available to us to deal with bullying. And out of those available, what's one or two of your favourite ways of dealing with bullying?
Again, for me, that is a really tough question. I have to come back to the idea that advice giving I find problematic. So that is at the outset. For me, the important thing is to listen. And maybe that comes out of the kind of counselling, etc. background of mine. But sometimes an individual who is experiencing bullying, particularly a young person, actually doesn't want, at some level, the adult to do anything. What they want is to be listened to and to have their story, to be able to tell the story of what is happening to them. And I think that notion of self-efficacy and the ability to self-regulate behaviour is an important part. So I think adults, particularly those in a position of care, one of the first responses that I would give would be to just listen to what the person is saying and take that on board and be respectful about it. And if it happens again, listen again. And if it happens again, listen again. And try to be as attentive as you can be to that individual and where they are and what they're experiencing, and hear their story. And out of that, I think, comes a response that is best suited to that individual in that circumstance at that time. And so for me, and I know that's a very intensive kind of way of working, and it would be better to have either a menu that you could trot out and say, okay, here's a good one, that works all the time, or this one works 90%. I think over and above that, there probably are some kind of conditions that a school, an organisation should have in place that provides opportunities to have that story told, either for the individual to write it down or to go to a trusted person. So I think there have to be very clear guidelines about what one can do. But I think from a one-to-one thing, for me, bullying is about relationships, and it's the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim, perpetrators and victims and the bystanders. But when it broadens out to the other people in the environment, the adults in the instance of kids, then I think one of the things to do is make sure that those adults are best equipped to listen as effectively as they can.
So training is important.
I think training is critical in all of this, and I despair in many ways in terms of teacher training and my involvement, where we don't equip our undergraduate teachers to go out with some knowledge around this that they can then complement. And I know different countries and different systems have different ways of training, and I can really only speak for Australia, but they do 3 or 4 years in teacher preparation. And I think that it's really significant that along that way that they're given opportunities to learn about relationships in schools, kids' relationships. Kids are spending 6 to 7 hours in school, and what they do is really relationship oriented, and their learning is, for me, is mediated through the relationships they have with their teachers, with their peers, and so I think equipping our teachers as fully as we can to work with kids around those relationship ideals is really important. For me, they say selling a house is about location. For me, teaching is about relationships.
So, I mean, on that point, in England, for example, anti-bullying training is not a core part of teacher training. That's not to say that teacher training providers don't provide anti-bullying training, but it's up to them whether they do or whether they don't. A lot of teachers, if not most teachers, learn anti-bullying training on the job.
Yes.
So is that similar in Australia?
Australia, in some ways, is perhaps unique. We have nationally introduced in 2002. A number of us were a part of a national movement initiated by the then Minister of Education to produce what was called the National Safe Schools Framework. The National Safe Schools Framework was a framework across Australia that was meant to provide a safe learning environment free from bullying and child abuse. And that one part of that, there were a number of different core principles that were inherent in the framework that we developed. And one of those was greater knowledge of what school bullying is. It wasn't mandated in the sense that schools had to have the framework, they had to be aware of it, but it couldn't be enforced in any strong sense. But I think at least it provided a foundation. And this year the National Safe Schools Framework was revised and relaunched by the new Minister for Education. And again, I think that's an affirmation of a commitment of a society. And although it can be said to just have symbolic kind of meaning, I think that at one level that's really important, that a society does accept that what it's trying to do is provide a just and fair and equitable place for young people to learn, and that adults have a significant role to play in that. Over and above that, I think that we in preparing teachers, that's what we have to do. We need to be preparing them to manage that, not on the job. I think there has to be some training and work that happens before. And I'd like to see that in Australia, I'd like to see that consolidated and recognised more fully than it currently is. Just a core part of how pre-service teachers undertake their training before they go out. And then I think with that foundation, there is nothing like learning on the job. But to throw them in cold, I think, is problematic.
Sure. Not just for them, but for the children they're working with.
For the children as well.
We are nearly at the end of the second day of the International Conference on Violence in Schools. How have you found it?
Again, it's a lovely environment to be in. I think for me, coming here to Argentina highlights that this issue is boundaryless. So we're recognising through the international research community that this issue around violence and bullying is something that cultures must come to grips with. And it's a really good thing to bring people together so that they can share best practice, they can share and develop relationships and look at joint work that will enrich what happens in their own countries, and that will enrich the countries they're part of. So I think coming here to Argentina and having that experience of a different culture and the way that it goes about providing the best possible working and living space for young people is really important.
What's been the highlight for you so far?
Again, and I go back to that notion of relationship, and I think the opportunity, not out of busyness, but simply out of being there, just to spend a little bit of time, have a coffee with people, catch up over a beer, nice glass of wine, and talk about what is happening that they are involved in, what are they passionate about, what engages them in their work, and it's those opportunities that I think are quite enriching for everyone.
Okay. Well, is there anything else that you'd like to say?
I think there's some very powerful medium that we overlook when we're addressing the issue of school bullying, and part of what is part of being able to do that effectively, I think, is to reach young people at levels that they are already engaging with. So I think that there are really significant changes that are occurring around technology and how relationships are getting conducted and how young people conduct their lives these days. Unless we're really across that, then I think we're missing the mark. I think there are other ways that cultures, and some cultures are better perhaps than others, through the arts and through theatre, where meaning making can occur. Young people can get a chance to experience and express what's happening to them through a whole range of activities. So painting and art and theatre, drama. I don't think that we should be looking to constrain and limit what we do, and I think we should be trying to use technology, because technology is now, we talk a little about that divide between the digital native and the digital immigrants, but I think it's moved beyond that a little bit. But at the same time, I think unless we embrace that technology and see how it can be used in a very positive and fulfilling way, then we're going to miss significantly what young people are engaging with these days.
And I think probably it's that young people are key in all of this process, aren't they? And it's, I think a lot of what you've been alluding to is how we can find ways to help young people, if you like, get ownership of these programs themselves.
I think, Andy, that for me, you asked me a little about what was important about bullying earlier on. The other issue for me is around student voice, and listening to the voice of young people, because if we don't do that, then I think we run the risk of seriously missing the mark, of being seriously dismissed, and we wouldn't want that as a community. I think that we would want to be trying to engage as fully as we can at all levels, and connecting in that way. So I think student voice, student ownership around this is a really key facet, that if it's imposed, I think that's missed. It has to come from within and under, as it were, in order to engage the stakeholders in it.
That's brilliant. Philip, thank you ever so much for doing this interview, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
I will. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.